Oftentimes, recognition of queerness in video games has situated queerness as something surface level, immediate, and clearly perceivable to the general audience. However, video game queerness is more than just representation. It is a deeper state of thinking that demands critical queer engagement from the audience. This is what Bo Ruberg argues in his academic book, Video Games Have Always Been Queer, stating that queerness in games can be seen from the start, through the subversive ways that games engage the audience. Because, in our culture, straightness is seen as the default state of being, therefore queerness becomes a concept of subversion, one that many neglect to consider in video game spaces, despite games themselves being subversive pieces of art. Fundamentally, queerness can be extracted in all games, not through surface level representation, but through more complex analyses of how games and players interact. Queerness in games is not a state of representation, but a state of play, and through being queer, we can inherently play games queerly, drawing queer interactions through the material, not necessarily to represent individuals, but to represent subversive experiences surrounding queerness in play. I seek here not to restate the discussion had in Video Games Have Always Been Queer, but to situate a new discussion on the concepts presented within the book. Considering the perpetual marginalization and discrimination of queer individuals, promoting queer characters within media is extremely productive and necessary, particularly in games where consumers are more directly engaged with the arts. When audiences see queer characters in games, those identities can become more normalized within culture, minimizing the risk of social othering of queer individuals, because many have seen individuals with similar identities within media. Queer games can help adjust for the seemingly irreconcilable inequity of queer individuals within culture. However, at the same time, limiting queerness to representation creates a shallow expectation of queerness that fails to meaningfully consider experience and interaction as crucial elements of queer livelihood. Queer characters do not inherently imply queer play, though they may serve as a reminder of queer existence. Instead, queer play must consider the actual act of playing in order to meaningfully represent queerness within game spaces. Queer play can be found in many forms, including the player's physical body and space. Within physical space, the way the player utilizes the controller for play may be, in itself, queer. This does not necessarily demand queerness from the player, however, but the ubiquity of controller usage across games can be used as grounds for queerness. In Video Games Have Always Been Queer, Bo Ruberg addresses speedrunning in games as a queer form of play through the subversive nature of the player-game interaction. Instead of playing through the game typically, say, a straight way of playing, speedrunners use their interaction with the game to create a distinctly subversive challenge that, while accomplishing the same ultimate objective as straight play, reaches that objective in a radically unique and challenging way. As opposed to traditional play, which holds room for imprecisions as a form of learning for the completion of a goal, speedrunning demands training to the point of precision in order to accomplish that goal. This isn't a form of play that the game was designed for, but one that the design allows. The player has created a unique way to play within the game, making the experience distinct and subversive. Though, of course, this form of queer experience within subversive play is not just limited to players' created challenges or methods of play, but can be deliberately designed aspects of the game as well. For instance, in Celeste, the difficulty of the platforming ties into a queer narrative of overcoming, but it also ties into the physicality of play. The experience of Celeste is not only communicated through the screen, but also through the act of playing. Because of the precision demanded by the game's difficulty, it's natural for players to become more aware of their interactions with the controller. In my case, speaking button presses as I navigated through tough levels created a verbal rhythm that reinforced my button pressing. Celeste, more than any other game before it, made me feel hyper-aware of my own physical body and space while playing, subverting traditional views of games where the controller is simply a requirement for play. Instead, the controller becomes a functional tool for play, relating the digital game to the physical experience of playing, thus queering traditional gameplay and the formation of experience through play. I am certainly not the first to discuss how Celeste uses difficulties to sincerely represent queer experiences of overcoming and reconciling with oneself. However, there is more to that representation than just the difficulty of the game. By creating that difficult experience, Celeste engages the player's physical self in order to draw that player into the queer narrative. Celeste creates a consciousness of one's own body and how it relates to a difficult challenge, which extends to the trans experience that Madeline is going through in the game. Representation of queerness is created both through character, but also through player and interaction. By becoming aware of your own body through play, play becomes queer. While queer play is not determined by the sexuality of the player's projection of their own identity or experience may determine how queerly the game is presented. Depending on the player's viewpoint, Stardew Valley is either ubiquitously gay or ubiquitously straight, with very little space in between the two. The player may queer the game through the in-game actions they take, which is often determined by the sexuality of the player as they relate that experience to themselves. Therefore, while queerness does exist in Stardew Valley, play itself is not necessarily queer, so the act of playing does not necessarily reinforce queerness and queer experiences depending on the sexuality of the player. This occurs as a result of bisexuality as a mechanic, which, by making every character player sexual, acknowledges queerness as an existing thing while not actually representing queerness or queer identities. Queerness in Stardew Valley is created through the acknowledgement of the player's choices regarding romance, though this decision affects the player more so than the game, as the player in a queer relationship within the game has not altered the remaining aspects of the world nor the other characters inhabiting that world. While not necessarily a detriment to Stardew Valley, and I'll note that Stardew Valley continues to be my favorite game of all time, this reinforcement of queerness in games is not limited to representation, but also includes the act of play. The representation of queerness in Stardew Valley doesn't directly acknowledge queer experiences, but the game may still be played queerly through a projection of the player's independent self. In his book, Bo Ruberg explains that if a game does not allow a player to take part in a same-sex romantic relationship or play as an explicitly queer character, the game is generally presumed to be straight by default. While Stardew Valley does allow for same-sex relationships, if the player does not discover this allowance and chooses to play the game in a straight way, the queerness of the game is easy to ignore, as the player may even consider the game to be straight. However, queer play still exists in Stardew Valley, as the player uses their own experiences to inform the methods by which they play the game, and the game is designed with enough player agency in mind to allow for that diversity in play. Before bisexuality as a mechanic was utilized in Fable, games promoted relationships with the expectation and constraint of straightness. Games were designed with a focus on straight play, though by subverting expectations of play, players could still play these games queerly. However, the queerness in play often had to, and still has to be justified as a legitimate mode of play, because in many cases, straightness and straight play is still considered the default expectation of experience in games. This creates an unreasonable demand, which we can see throughout culture as well, where queer individuals have to justify the validity of their queerness to the straight population, often those that declare they are authorities to decide. This cultural phenomenon is echoed through games as the act of queer play. Indeed, even if Stardew Valley did not allow for same-sex relationships, the game still could fundamentally be played queerly. Games are multifaceted in the purpose that they serve and the way they seek to serve them. This can include games that reject concepts of fun in order to promote compelling narratives and social critiques, which is a fundamentally queer concept. Rejecting fun does not correlate to a rejection of engagement that connects the player to the game. Fun implies that games are one-note pieces of entertainment, serving a single purpose of providing the player with streamlined enjoyment, which is an inherently straight form of playing games. In this form of play, the end goal is success within the game, and the player is linearly and directly in pursuit of that goal throughout the entirety of their play. Recognizing this, we can consider the opposite, that play does not revolve around the purpose of fun, making it inherently queer as it subverts the expectations of simplicity and fun. When a game is not attempting to be fun, the game can focus on individualized engagement and the conveyance of more meaningful and nuanced narratives. The player is able to find satisfaction in the game through subversive and unexpected methods, either intended or unintended, through the design of the game. Queer play can be diverse, exploratory, and multi-purposed. The player then has several avenues to pursue play based on their own desired experience without the constraints of fun or success within that game. Likewise, as queer play does not demand the pursuits of success within the game, queer play may embrace, as Bo Ruber calls it, the queer arts of failure. This can be entertainment derived from repeated failures, especially those failures relate to a struggle in the connection between the player and game, or the exploration of play beyond what the game considers to be successful play. The time spent not playing towards a goal can still be inherently enjoyable, yet subversive in the experience it provides. The enjoyment had from playing does not need to derive from the designed intent of the game, but rather through the queer and subversive ways through which a player engages. Going back to Celeste, the queer art of failure becomes potent. Through the game, several times the player will fail to overcome an obstacle or challenge, leading to a constant and repeated failure or death. Yet this does not detract from the enjoyment of the experience, but adds to it, reinforcing the act of queer play. The game conveys experience through repeated failure and shortcoming. Queer play is something that can be had in any game regardless of the design or intent. The act of queer play exists in any form that allows for subversion, interacting with the player in the game in unique ways to convey or create experience. Queerness in games is not just a facet of representation, but something that is created through the very act of playing, allowing for more nuanced discussions of queerness within games. Ultimately, queer play is not about playing to succeed or win, but playing to experience.